July 20th, 1944. The Wolf's Lair, deep in the forests of East Prussia. Inside a wooden conference room, Adolf Hitler leans over a map table, studying the deteriorating Eastern Front. In less than an hour, a bomb will explode just feet away from him, the culmination of years of planning by a desperate network of German officers who believed killing Hitler was the only way to save their country from total destruction. This is the story of Operation Valkyrie, the most famous and nearly successful attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler. But to understand how it all came to that sweltering July day, we need to go back several years, to a time when the seeds of resistance were first planted in the minds of some of Germany's most decorated military officers. The German resistance to Hitler was never a single, unified movement. It was a scattered collection of individuals from different backgrounds, military officers, diplomats, aristocrats, clergy, and civilians, all united by a growing horror at what their country had become. Many of these men had initially supported Hitler, or at least cooperated with the Nazi regime. Some had even celebrated early victories in Poland and France. But as the war dragged on and the true nature of Nazi atrocities became impossible to ignore, a core group began to believe that Hitler had to be removed, not just for moral reasons, but because he was leading Germany to absolute annihilation. Among the earliest military conspirators was General Ludwig Beck, the former chief of the German General Staff, who had resigned in 1938 in protest over Hitler's reckless war plans. Beck had seen firsthand how Hitler dismissed professional military advice, how he overruled experienced commanders, how he made decisions based on ideology rather than strategic reality. Beck believed that Hitler's leadership would inevitably lead to Germany's destruction, and he was right. But resigning wasn't enough. Beck would spend the war years quietly building a network of like-minded officers, waiting for the right moment to act. Another key figure was Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service. Canaris was a complex, enigmatic figure who managed to maintain his position while secretly protecting resistors and feeding information to the conspiracy. His deputy, Hans Oster, was even more actively involved, using the Abwehr as cover for resistance activities. These men understood that any coup attempt would need careful coordination, support from key military units, and above all, the death of Hitler himself. As long as the Führer lived, German soldiers and officials would remain bound by their personal oath of loyalty to him. The resistance also included civilians like Karl Goerdeler, the former mayor of Leipzig, who worked tirelessly to create plans for a post-Hitler government. There was Ulrich von Hassel, a former ambassador, and members of the Kreisau Circle, an intellectual resistance group that met at the estate of Helmuth James von Moltke. But for all their moral courage and careful planning, these civilians lacked one crucial element: direct access to Hitler and the military force necessary to seize power after his death. That's where Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg entered the picture. Stauffenberg was born into an aristocratic Catholic family in Bavaria in 1907. Tall, charismatic, and brilliant, he seemed destined for military leadership from an early age. He joined the German army in 1926 and rose quickly through the ranks, distinguishing himself as a cavalry officer with an exceptional strategic mind. In the early years of the war, Stauffenberg fought in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Like many officers, he initially viewed the war as a defense of Germany, but he became increasingly disturbed by SS atrocities he witnessed, particularly the mass murder of Jews and civilians in the occupied territories. By 1942, Stauffenberg's views had crystallized. He confided to friends that Hitler was leading Germany to disaster, and that the criminal nature of the regime could no longer be ignored. But he was still a serving officer, deeply involved in the war effort. That changed dramatically in April 1943, when Stauffenberg's unit was attacked by Allied aircraft in Tunisia. The strafing left him grievously wounded. He lost his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers on his left hand. Many thought his military career was over, but Stauffenberg's injuries, rather than ending his usefulness to the resistance, made him indispensable. During his months of recovery, his opposition to Hitler hardened into absolute resolve. When he returned to duty in the fall of 1943, he was appointed Chief of Staff to General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the Reserve Army. This position would give him access to 2 critical elements: regular meetings with Hitler himself and control over Operation Valkyrie. Operation Valkyrie was the code name for an emergency continuity of government plan approved by Hitler himself. It was designed to be activated in case of a breakdown in civil order, such as a revolt by the millions of foreign slave laborers working in German factories, or an uprising by Allied prisoners of war. Under Valkyrie, the Reserve Army would mobilize, take control of key government buildings and communication centers, and restore order. The brilliant, audacious idea of Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators was to hijack this legitimate emergency plan and use it to seize power after Hitler's assassination. The plan was elegantly simple in concept, but extraordinarily complex in execution. Stauffenberg would assassinate Hitler at a military conference. Immediately after the bomb exploded, the conspirators would send out Valkyrie orders to reserve army units throughout Germany and occupied territories, claiming that the SS had attempted a coup and that the army needed to take control to restore order. Key figures would be arrested: Himmler, Goebbels, Göring, and other top Nazis. Communications would be seized to prevent any counter-narrative. A new government, led by Beck and Goerdeler, would negotiate an immediate peace with the Western Allies, hoping to avoid total occupation and perhaps even keep Germany's eastern territories. It was a desperate gamble, but by 1944, the conspirators believed they had no choice. The Soviets were advancing from the east, the Allies had landed in Normandy, and Germany faced certain defeat. Moreover, the resistance had learned details of the Holocaust, the systematic murder of millions of Jews and other victims in death camps across occupied Europe. Every day, Hitler remained in power meant more death, more destruction, more crimes that would stain Germany's name forever. But assassinating Hitler proved far more difficult than anyone imagined. The Führer was intensely paranoid and surrounded by multiple layers of security. His schedule was unpredictable, his movements secret, his food tested for poison, his quarters guarded by fanatically loyal SS troops. Multiple attempts were made and aborted in late 1943 and early 1944. Each time, something went wrong. Security was too tight. The venue changed at the last minute, or key Nazi leaders weren't present. The conspirators had decided that for the coup to succeed, they needed to kill not just Hitler, but also Himmler and Göring in the same attack, to completely decapitate the Nazi leadership. This requirement proved nearly impossible to fulfill. Hitler, Himmler, and Göring were rarely in the same place at the same time. By July 1944, with the military situation deteriorating daily and the Gestapo closing in on the resistance network, Stauffenberg and his inner circle made a crucial decision. They would kill Hitler alone. Even if the other Nazi leaders weren't present, it was now or never. The plan centered on Stauffenberg's position and his regular access to Hitler's military briefings. As Chief of Staff of the Reserve Army, Stauffenberg was occasionally required to brief Hitler on the status of new army divisions being formed. These briefings took place at various locations. Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, his headquarters in Berlin, or most frequently at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Hitler's heavily fortified field headquarters near the Eastern Front. The Wolf's Lair was a sprawling complex of bunkers, barracks, and buildings hidden in thick forests and surrounded by minefields, checkpoints, and guard posts. Visitors had to pass through multiple security rings, each one more restrictive than the last. Everyone entering Hitler's inner compound was searched, and anyone attending a conference with the Führer was checked again. This made smuggling in a bomb incredibly risky, but it also meant that if Stauffenberg could get a bomb past security, he would be one of the few people in the room, in close proximity to Hitler. But assassinating Hitler proved far more difficult than anyone imagined. The Führer was intensely paranoid and surrounded by multiple layers of security. His schedule was unpredictable, his movements secret, his food tested for poison, his quarters guarded by fanatically loyal SS troops. Multiple attempts were made and aborted in late 1943 and early 1944. Each time, something went wrong. Security was too tight, the venue changed at the last minute, or key Nazi leaders weren't present. The conspirators had decided that for the coup to succeed, they needed to kill not just Hitler, but also Himmler and Göring in the same attack, to completely decapitate the Nazi leadership. This requirement proved nearly impossible to fulfill. Hitler, Himmler, and Göring were rarely in the same place at the same time. By July 1944, with the military situation deteriorating daily and the Gestapo closing in on the resistance network, Stauffenberg and his inner circle made a crucial decision. They would kill Hitler alone, even if the other Nazi leaders weren't present. It was now or never. The plan centered on Stauffenberg's position and his regular access to Hitler's military briefings. As Chief of Staff of the Reserve Army, Stauffenberg was occasionally required to brief Hitler on the status of new army divisions being formed. These briefings took place at various locations: Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, his headquarters in Berlin, or most frequently, at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Hitler's heavily fortified field headquarters near the Eastern Front. The Wolf's Lair was a sprawling complex of bunkers, barracks, and buildings, hidden in thick forests and surrounded by minefields, checkpoints, and guard posts. Visitors had to pass through multiple security rings, each one more restrictive than the last. Everyone entering Hitler's inner compound was searched, and anyone attending a conference with the Führer was checked again. This made smuggling in a bomb incredibly risky, but it also meant that if Stauffenberg could get a bomb past security, he would be one of the few people in the room, in close proximity to Hitler. Stauffenberg obtained 2 British-made plastic explosive devices from the Abwehr. Each bomb was small enough to fit in a briefcase and was triggered by a chemical time delay fuse. You crushed the fuse with pliers, which broke a vial of acid. The acid would eat through a wire, releasing a spring that struck the detonator. Depending on the temperature, the fuse would detonate the bomb in about 10 minutes. This gave Stauffenberg enough time to arm the bomb, enter the conference room, place the briefcase near Hitler, excuse himself, and get to a safe distance before the explosion. There was just one problem. Stauffenberg only had 3 fingers on his left hand, and no right hand at all. He would need help from his aide, Lieutenant Werner von Haeften, to prepare the bombs. And they would need privacy and time to do it, which would be nearly impossible in the tightly controlled environment of the Wolf's Lair. Stauffenberg made several trips to Hitler's headquarters in July 1944, each time carrying the bombs, waiting for the right moment. On July 11th, he was ready to act, But Himmler wasn't present. He aborted. On July 15th, another opportunity arose, but again, key Nazi leaders were absent, and General Fromm, who would need to issue the Valkyrie orders, was wavering in his commitment. Stauffenberg returned to Berlin without acting. The conspirators in Berlin had actually begun issuing preliminary orders before realizing the attempt had been called off. They had to scramble to cover their tracks, claiming it was just an exercise. These false starts created enormous tension within the conspiracy. Every failed attempt increased the risk of discovery. The Gestapo was already investigating suspicious activities, and several members of the resistance were under surveillance. Some conspirators wanted to abandon the plot entirely, believing it had become too dangerous and too unlikely to succeed. But Stauffenberg was resolute. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, witnessed too many horrors to turn back now. The assassination would happen, even if he had to act alone. The date was set, July 20th, 1944. Stauffenberg would attend a military briefing at the Wolf's Lair to present a report on the formation of new reserve army divisions. He flew from Berlin to East Prussia early that morning with Lieutenant Haeften, both men carrying briefcases containing the explosive devices. In Berlin, the other conspirators prepared for Valkyrie. General Erich Höppner, who had been dismissed by Hitler years earlier, put on his uniform and waited to assume command of the Home Army. Ludwig Beck prepared to lead the new government. Friedrich Olbricht, Stauffenberg's immediate superior, readied the orders that would be sent to military districts across Germany and occupied Europe. Everything hinged on what happened in the next few hours. Stauffenberg and Haeften landed at the Wolf's Lair around 10:30 in the morning and were driven through the security checkpoints to the inner compound. They were early for the briefing, which was scheduled for 12:30. The extra time was intentional. They needed to find a place to arm the bombs. But almost immediately, things started to go wrong. Stauffenberg was told the meeting had been moved up to 12:30 because Mussolini was arriving that afternoon, and Hitler wanted the military briefing finished before the Italian dictator's visit. This meant less time to prepare. Then came worse news. The briefing would not be held in Hitler's underground bunker as usual, but in a wooden conference barracks above ground. This was a disaster for the plan. The bunker was made of reinforced concrete with small windows. An explosion there would be devastating, the shockwave and debris contained and amplified by the solid walls. But a wooden building with windows would allow much of the blast force to escape. The chance of killing Hitler had just dropped significantly. Stauffenberg had no time to reconsider. He and Haeften requested permission to wash up and change their shirts before the meeting. They were shown to a private room, and this was their chance. But they had only a few minutes, and they were interrupted. A sergeant major knocked on the door, telling them to hurry because the meeting was about to start. Working frantically with his 3 remaining fingers, Stauffenberg managed to arm one bomb, crushing the acid fuse with pliers. He didn't have time to prepare the second device. If he had managed to arm both bombs, the explosion would have been twice as powerful, likely enough to kill everyone in the room, even in the wooden building. But there was no more time. Stauffenberg placed the armed bomb in his briefcase and headed to the conference barracks, leaving Haeften behind with the second, unarmed device. He entered the briefing room at approximately 12:35. The room was long and narrow, about 40 feet by 15 feet, with a large oak map table dominating the center. Windows lined both long walls, already open because of the summer heat. About 24 officers and officials crowded around the table, studying maps of the Eastern Front. Hitler stood near the middle of one long side of the table, leaning forward to examine the maps, his back partially turned to the door. Stauffenberg entered and was greeted by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, who showed him where to stand. Stauffenberg positioned himself to Hitler's right, perhaps 6 feet away, and placed his briefcase under the table, pushing it as close to Hitler as he could. The heavy oak table support was directly between the bomb and Hitler's legs. Then Stauffenberg did something that should have seemed suspicious, but somehow didn't. He excused himself, saying he needed to take an urgent phone call. He left the room and walked quickly toward the exit of the compound. Behind him, the briefing continued. Lieutenant Colonel Heinz Brandt, annoyed that Stauffenberg's briefcase was in his way as he tried to get closer to the map, bent down and moved it to the other side of the heavy table support, farther from Hitler. This simple, innocent action would save Hitler's life. Stauffenberg found Heften waiting by their car. They watched the barracks from a distance. At 12:42, the bomb exploded. The blast was enormous. The entire barracks seemed to lift off its foundation. Flames and smoke erupted from the shattered windows. Debris flew in all directions. To Stauffenberg and Heften, watching from a distance, it seemed impossible that anyone inside could have survived. They threw the second unarmed bomb from their vehicle as they raced toward the first checkpoint, hoping to escape the compound before the alarm was raised. Getting out would be just as difficult as getting in. Stauffenberg bluffed his way through the first checkpoint, claiming he had an urgent appointment in Berlin and couldn't be delayed. His confidence and rank got them through. At the second checkpoint, the guards had heard the explosion and had orders to seal the compound. No one was to leave. But Stauffenberg was insistent, even calling an officer he knew at headquarters to demand the checkpoint be opened. Incredibly, it worked. The officer, Captain von Müllendorf, ordered the checkpoint opened, and Stauffenberg's car sped through. They made it to the airfield and took off for Berlin around 1 p.m., convinced that Hitler was dead. But Hitler was alive. The heavy oak table support, combined with the open windows and wooden construction of the building, had saved him. 4 men were killed in the explosion. The officer who moved the briefcase, Heinz Brandt, stenographer Heinrich Berger, General Gunther Korten, and Colonel Rudolf Schmundt, Hitler's chief adjutant. Several others were seriously wounded. But Hitler suffered only minor injuries. His hair was singed, his trousers shredded, his legs bruised, and his eardrums damaged. He was helped from the burning wreckage, shaken but alive, and within minutes, enraged. Back in Berlin, the conspirators had no idea Hitler had survived. Communications from the Wolf's Lair were confused and contradictory. Stauffenberg couldn't be reached because he was in the air. General Olbricht made a crucial mistake. He hesitated to issue the Valkyrie orders without confirmation that Hitler was dead. This delay, just a few hours, would prove fatal to the entire operation. When Stauffenberg landed in Berlin around 2:45 p.m., he immediately called the conspirators' headquarters at the Bendler Block, the complex of buildings housing the German Army High Command. He told them Hitler was definitely dead. He had seen the explosion himself. But Olbricht had disturbing news. There were reports from the Wolf's Lair that Hitler had survived. Stauffenberg insisted this was impossible. He had been there. No one could have survived that blast. The reports must be propaganda or confusion. Based on Stauffenberg's certainty, the conspirators finally activated Operation Valkyrie at 4 p.m., nearly 3.5 hours after the explosion. The delay was catastrophic. Orders went out to military districts to arrest Nazi officials and take control of government buildings. In some cities, these orders were followed. In Paris, the military commander began rounding up SS and Gestapo officers. In Vienna, Nazi officials were briefly detained. But in Berlin, everything started to unravel almost immediately. General Fromm, who was supposed to be part of the conspiracy, refused to cooperate. He had received confirmation from the Wolf's Lair that Hitler was alive and speaking. Fromm understood what this meant. The coup had failed, and anyone associated with it would be executed. He tried to arrest Stauffenberg and the other conspirators, but they arrested him instead and locked him in an office. This should have been a sign to abandon the coup, but Stauffenberg and the inner circle pressed forward. They believed that if they could control Berlin and the communication networks, they could still succeed even with Hitler alive. They were wrong. Without Hitler's death, the entire premise of Operation Valkyrie fell apart. Officers receiving Valkyrie orders were confused. Who had authorized them? Was this legitimate? Some reports said Hitler was dead, others said he was alive. Crucially, officers were bound by their personal oath to Hitler. If the Führer lived, they couldn't support a coup against him, no matter what the reserve army ordered. At the Bendler block, Stauffenberg spent the afternoon and evening on the phone, trying to convince wavering commanders to follow through with the coup. His charisma and determination won over some, but not enough. And then, at 6:30 p.m., disaster struck. Hitler's voice came over the radio. He was alive. He addressed the German people, his voice slightly hoarse but unmistakably his, denouncing the very small clique of ambitious, irresponsible, and at the same time senseless and criminally stupid officers who had tried to kill him. He vowed ruthless revenge. That broadcast sealed the coup's fate. Officers who had been following Valkyrie orders immediately stopped. Some began arresting the conspirators who had sent those orders. In Berlin, pro-Nazi officers in the Bendler block realized what was happening and turned on the plotters. Major Otto Ernst Remer, commander of the Berlin Guard Battalion, had initially followed Valkyrie orders to seal off the government quarter. But when Goebbels, who had not been arrested, reached Remer by phone and put Hitler on the line, Remer switched sides immediately. He surrounded the Bendler block with his troops. By midnight, it was over. Pro-Nazi officers stormed into the Bendler block. There was a brief firefight. Stauffenberg was shot in the shoulder. The conspirators were rounded up. General Fromm, desperate to prove his loyalty and cover up his own involvement with the plot, immediately convened a summary court-martial. He knew that if these men lived to be interrogated by the Gestapo, they might implicate him. He needed them dead, quickly. Around 12:30 a.m. on July 21st, just 12 hours after the bomb had exploded at the Wolf's Lair, Stauffenberg, Haeften, Olbricht, and Stauffenberg's aide Albrecht Merz von Quernheim were taken down to the courtyard of the Bendler block. Makeshift lights from a truck illuminated the execution site. They were shot by firing squad one by one. Stauffenberg was second. According to witnesses, his last words were, "Long live sacred Germany." Ludwig Beck was allowed to shoot himself, but when he failed to die, he was finished off by a sergeant. Fromm hoped these quick executions would end the matter. He was wrong. The Gestapo was just beginning its investigation. Hitler's revenge was swift and merciless. He ordered the conspirators hunted down, tortured, and killed in the most degrading ways possible. Thousands were arrested in the following months. The Gestapo investigation expanded far beyond the immediate plotters, ensnaring anyone with even remote connections to the conspiracy. Show trials were held before the notorious People's Court, presided over by the fanatical judge Roland Freisler, who screamed abuse at the defendants and ensured their convictions. The executions were designed to be as cruel as possible. Many of the conspirators, including former generals and distinguished officers, were hanged slowly with piano wire from meat hooks while being filmed. Hitler reportedly watched these films. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had been loosely connected to the conspiracy but had not participated actively, was given the choice of a public trial or suicide. He chose suicide. Thousands of others, soldiers, diplomats, clergy, academics, were executed or sent to concentration camps. Even family members of the conspirators were arrested under the Nazi doctrine of Sippenhaft, or blood guilt. Admiral Canaris was arrested in the aftermath of the plot. He had been too clever for too long, and now the Gestapo had their chance. He was tortured and eventually hanged in April 1945, just weeks before the war ended. Karl Goerdeler was arrested in August after hiding for weeks. He was tortured for months to extract information about other conspirators, then executed in February 1945. Hans Oster was hanged at Flossenbürg concentration camp in April 1945, along with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran pastor and theologian who had been part of the resistance. All told, nearly 5,000 people were executed in connection with the July 20th plot. The question that haunts Operation Valkyrie is, what if it had succeeded? What if Stauffenberg had armed both bombs? What if the meeting had been in the concrete bunker instead of the wooden barracks? What if Hitler had been standing just a few feet closer to the briefcase? Would Germany have surrendered? Would millions of lives have been saved in the final months of the war? The truth is, we'll never know. Even if Hitler had died, the coup faced enormous obstacles. The SS and Gestapo would have fought back. Many Wehrmacht officers, even those who privately disliked Hitler, were still bound by their oath and their nationalism. The Allies had already declared they would accept only unconditional surrender, so there was no guarantee of a negotiated peace. Some historians believe the coup would have triggered a civil war within Germany, with different factions of the military, SS, and Nazi Party fighting for control. Others think that without Hitler's fanatical refusal to surrender, pragmatic German commanders might have ended the war months earlier, saving countless lives on all sides. What we do know is this: the July 20th plotters acted when action required extraordinary courage. They knew the odds of success were slim. They knew that failure meant death, not just for themselves, but for their families. They acted anyway, not because they were certain they would succeed, but because they believed it was the right thing to do. Many of them were not Democrats or liberals in any modern sense. They were conservative military officers and aristocrats who had initially supported Hitler, or at least cooperated with the Nazi regime. But they reached a point where they could no longer serve a government they believed was both evil and leading their nation to destruction. Stauffenberg, in particular, transformed from a loyal officer into a would-be assassin willing to sacrifice everything. His journey was not unique among the conspirators, but his role was central, and his courage in those final months was remarkable. Injured, disabled, he could have retired honorably. Instead, he chose to carry bombs into Hitler's headquarters, knowing that discovery meant torture and death. For decades after the war, the legacy of the July 20th plotters was controversial in Germany. Some saw them as heroes who tried to stop Hitler. Others viewed them as traitors who betrayed their country in wartime. The fact that many conspirators had initially supported the Nazi regime, and that some held anti-Semitic views or had participated in the war effort that killed millions, complicated their legacy. Were they heroes or opportunists? Did they act from moral conviction, or because they saw Germany was losing the war? Modern historians generally view the conspirators with more nuance. They were flawed human beings, products of their time and class, who nonetheless took a stand against tyranny when it mattered most. They acted too late to prevent the worst horrors of the Holocaust, but they acted when many others chose complicity or silence. Stauffenberg himself seems to have been genuinely motivated by a sense that the Nazi regime was both morally wrong and strategically disastrous for Germany. Today, there are memorials to the July 20th plotters throughout Germany. The courtyard at the Bendler block, where Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators were executed, is now a memorial site. Streets and buildings are named after them. They are taught in schools as examples of resistance to tyranny, however imperfect and belated that resistance was. The German military, the Bundeswehr, honors them as models of military personnel who stood up against unjust orders and criminal leadership. Operation Valkyrie failed. Hitler lived. The war continued for another 9 months, killing millions more soldiers and civilians, destroying cities, culminating in Germany's total defeat and occupation. But the plot was not meaningless. It demonstrated that even in the darkest totalitarian regime, resistance was possible. It showed that some Germans were willing to risk everything to oppose Hitler, even when success seemed hopeless. And it left a legacy that continues to inspire debates about duty, obedience, patriotism, and the moral responsibility to resist evil, even when that evil wears the uniform of your own government. In the end, Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators failed to kill Hitler, failed to seize power, failed to end the war early. But they succeeded in one crucial way. They proved that not all Germans were complicit, that some were willing to fight back, and that courage and conscience could survive even in the heart of a totalitarian state. That is the true legacy of Operation Valkyrie, the plot that failed, but is remembered not for its failure, but for the desperate, dangerous act of resistance it represented in humanity's darkest hour.